Great. Well, see there, I did not even let a minor injury, a muscle pull, get in my way. I had to come and join you all. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you to President Foster for inviting me and for that wonderful dinner last night and the conversation we had. And, there's a lot of ways to start, but I should say that I'm here in part because my column runs in the Daily Sentinel in Grand Junction, has for a number of years. I get a lot of great mail from here. President Foster has read it over time and has liked a lot of what he's read and doesn't have to agree with all of it, but he appreciates the thought that goes into it. And so I got an email sometime back saying, we'd love to have you come out to Colorado Mesa University, and we got to rolling on it. And I think I may have said at one point, we'd love to do this, and if you get me out there, then I'll give a talk, but I'll be there anyway, so feel free to use me during the day and get me out to a few classes. And I guess I spoke too soon, right? Because they took me up on that. So I've had a long day and a very good day, but it started with an early morning breakfast at the Daily Sentinel. This is after the stimulating dinner last night with the Fosters. So I went to have a conversation with my fellow journalists this morning at the Daily Sentinel, and then I went to a mass communications course, and we talked about media and mass communications. And then I had a quick Starbucks break on campus, and then I went to a political science class to talk about poli-sci. And then I went to lunch, and this is all before noon. And about 11:30 or so, I go to lunch that the president has gathered, some very bright students that I've met all day here, and they were asking me a bunch of questions about a whole bunch of things. So before I knew it, I realized it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I've had exactly one decent meal, and that was my lunch with the group. And I've spoken to 3 groups already. I've given 3 speeches, and it was great fun, and we had a great exchange of ideas. So very, very stimulating. And so they said, we have a break, for the next couple of hours. You can go back to your hotel room and rest up before your talk. And in a normal world, I might go back to my hotel room and actually, call my wife, which I did, and check in on my kids, which I did, and call my editor and check in with my bosses, because they were editing a column of mine. But today was not a normal day. I may have taken a nap. I didn't get a chance to take a nap. And the reason was, last night at midnight after the Foster's dinner, I went home and I thought, I think I should maybe get a jump on my column for tomorrow, because my editor's at the Post, they'll be in Washington. I'll send them the column early. I know, I'll write a column about Brett Kavanaugh. And so I sent it at midnight, and I thought to myself as I pushed sent last night from Colorado, I thought, you know what? I don't suppose anything will happen tomorrow. And so it's not like I'll have to go back into it and rewrite it. It'll be ready to go. And during the course of the day, as I'm speaking here on campus, my phone is going, buzzing, and I'm looking, what the heck's going on? And I finally get to the television, and I realize that there have been 6 different developments in the Kavanaugh story in the course of maybe 10 hours today. And so we're constantly rewriting the thing. And so I'm on the phone with the bosses, and they're saying, is this current? And I said, well, it was current as of 6 hours ago. I don't know what's happened. Well, it was current as of 10 minutes ago. I don't know what's happened now. So, for those of you who don't know, this is the absolute latest. I bring bad news. It depends on how you feel about circuses. If you like circuses, I have good news. And that is that these accusations against Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court nominee, they have now decided to postpone the vote that was scheduled for Thursday. And 1 week from today, it's now been announced that Kavanaugh's accuser, who is Christy Ford, who is a California professor who has made these accusations, will be testifying in the Senate before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the morning of Monday morning. And in the afternoon, Brett Kavanaugh will be speaking to address what's been said. Can you imagine that? Well, first of all, it's must-see TV, right? All my political junkie friends are just like, boom, their heads are exploding. And imagine being able to sit back on Monday and watch, in the course of just a few hours, the accuser and the accused, both of this. And for those of us who remember 1991 and the Clarence Thomas hearings, we are right back there again. And I had lived through that once, and I prayed I would never have to live through it again. But here we are. So that was my day. Interesting it was. And yet I wanted to come here and speak to you, and I was so intrigued by the idea of Constitution Day and the chance to come and talk about the Constitution and what it means to me and what it's meant to my work and the kind of stories I've written over the years, that I jumped at the chance to do it. So first let me tell you a little bit more about myself and what I do, and then we'll jump into a conversation about the Constitution, and then I want to take your questions about either the stuff I say about the Constitution or anything that's in the news or what I do, or if you have a beef with the news media, this is your chance. Anything you've said, I probably have written and said before as well, critical of my own tribe of journalists and where we are these days. By way of my background, you heard President Foster say a few things about me, but here are some other things about me that maybe don't come through in a biography. My dad was a cop for 37 years. I was raised the son of a cop. I was raised on a very straight and narrow path. I never stole a stick of gum from a store. I was always afraid of the law and of authority. And my son, my 11-year-old, has inherited that. If you lay out the rules for him, he will follow the rules, and he will be very nervous if anybody around him doesn't follow the rules. My two daughters, not so much. Not so much. They are not sticklers for the rules. My 9-year-old and my 13-year-old girl, they march to their own drum, like mommy. So he's like me, and they're like mommy. What else should you know? My wife, I spoke today and I said that I'm in a mixed marriage because my wife and I have been married for 15 years. Our wedding anniversary is actually next week, and I have to have something nice planned when I get home. And on those 15 years, my wife was born in Mexico, in Guadalajara. She came to the United States, to San Diego first, and then later to Dallas, where I met her. And she came here with her 3 sisters, so she's one of 4 girls. They all came because their mom got them visas to come, so they all came legally back when they were kids. And then ultimately she became a citizen of her own accord. So she had to learn about the Constitution and study up on the 3 branches of government and train herself for all of that. Now she's studying for a teacher's credential, so she is learning all this stuff again. And she'll ask me these questions out of the blue, and I'll retrieve these answers from the back of my head. And she'll be like, "How did you know that?" And I said, "I have all this useless information in my head from many years ago." And this is kind of how the order of succession and things like that, things that we learned in 8th grade that I never forgot. So there's that, and I say I'm in a mixed marriage because my wife's Mexican and I'm Mexican-American. There are times where it's like Mars and Venus, 2 different species. And very much in my DNA is the education I learned and I took from growing up in the United States. So I learned about John Locke influencing Thomas Jefferson. I learned about James Madison writing the Constitution. I learned about the Federalist Papers. I learned about the debate between federalism and states' rights. All those things, the preamble to the Constitution. I had to take this 8th grade class to pass it so I can go on to the 9th grade on the Constitution. And so I'm very much, despite the fact that I refer to myself as a Mexican-American, and my grandfather came from Mexico, again, another one legally, I always have to say that. He came, but I also say no gold star for Grandpa because he came in around 1915 during the Mexican Revolution, which lasted from 1910 to 1920. And he came legally along with 600,000 other Mexicans who all came to the US during that time. And every one of them came legally because you couldn't come illegally until 1924, when Congress passed a law to restrict primarily people from Italy. The euphemism was, we don't want to keep out the Italians, that would be racist. We want to keep out people from Southern Europe. So I was at Ellis Island in New York, and if you ever get a chance, when you go to New York, don't just visit the Statue of Liberty, also go to Ellis Island Museum. There's an exhibit on the 1924 immigration law, and it says this was passed to limit immigration from Southern Europe. And you look at it, and it's the boot of Italy. So, the Italian Exclusion Act of 1924. So let's see, my grandfather was a legal immigrant, my dad was a cop, I'm married to a Mexican immigrant. She is confused about what part of me is actually Mexican, because everything about me seems to be American. When we're watching the news, she'll say things like, I'll be watching the news and there'll be this protest in Mexico City, and I'll say, I do not understand. Why don't these people just gather up, petition their government, organize, and vote this person out of office? And she'll look at me like, you're such an American, right? And I said, yeah, Englishman John Locke influenced Thomas Jefferson, wrote the Declaration of Independence, James Madison wrote the Constitution. And she goes, and you don't understand how things work in Mexico. If you try that in Mexico, you will disappear one day and you will be gone. And they will never find you. And I'm like, what? Huh? What? So she will occasionally tease me and say, now tell me again, exactly what kind of Mexican are you? And I'll say, I'm the American kind. That's a Mexican American. So there's that. My wife is also convinced that every single person who voted for Donald Trump, and I disagree with her on this, and I'm never going to convince her, I just never am. She's convinced that every single person who voted for Donald Trump did so from a place of fear and anger and racism against Mexicans. That everybody who voted for Trump is a racist who doesn't like Mexicans, right? And I have to remind her, this includes people we live with in our neighborhood, right? Who socialize with us, who go to our barbecues and things. And I tell her, that is not true in my mind. It's not fair. It's not accurate. There are plenty of people out there who voted for Trump. I'm not one of them. But they voted for Trump for lots of different reasons that had nothing at all to do with race. So we have this constant conversation. And then she says, well, you think that way because you're an American. So I just can't argue with that. Secondly, in terms of what I do for a living, I see my job and my role as looking at a very complicated world that becomes very complicated and muddy all the time and very foggy. And I wake up every morning and there's a bunch of fog. And the fog has been generated overnight by the political parties, by public relations firms, by lawyers and spinners, by people whose job it is to just generate fog. And their job is to so cloud the picture so that we really don't understand what's going on. And it's my job to clear the fog. And so whether we're talking about immigration or abortion or gun control or a Supreme Court nominee or whatever the issue is of the day, there's going to be a lot of fog. My primary job is to clear the fog. My job is not to be a social worker to make the country a better place, make the world a better place. My job is not to tell you how to vote or tell you what to think. It's certainly not to jump into the arena as a combatant and fight the president one-on-one, mano-a-mano. That's not my job either. I already feel like my job's big enough already because there's so much fog, you spend so much time trying to clear the fog. Once I clear the fog, I digest whatever the issue is. I come up with an interesting way to present that issue. And then I write this column in 750 words, and I take the complicated and make it simple. It was explained to me by a friend who writes novels, a novelist, who said, you know the difference between professors and journalists? And I said, no. She goes, professors, when you think about it, academics, they take the simple and make it complicated. Okay? You can get a professor in the history department, and he knows everything there is to know, he or she, about the year 1925 to 1930. Now, they know it backward and forward. They might not know much about what happened last week, but they got that little period right. And they take the simple, make it complicated. I get paid to do the opposite. I get paid to take the complicated and make it simple. So it's my job to take a complicated world and explain it to all of you, best I can. I don't care how you come out on it. I'm not here to sell you on one party or the other, or one candidate on the other. I just want you to think. I want you to think through this stuff. And then you come to your own conclusion, and I don't want to run for office, but I want you to run for office. So you'll run for office as an informed member of the electorate because of what you read in one of my columns. So that's great. To give you an idea of how I approach my work, I was thinking about Brett Kavanaugh today, and I thought, you know what would be an interesting column? I have two daughters. I'm the son, as I said, of a police officer who was taught to respect the law, but I'm also the father of two daughters who are 9 and 13, and I don't want my daughters to grow up in a world where men feel entitled to engage in the kind of behavior that Brett Kavanaugh is accused to have conducted or engaged in. Again, alleged and accused, we don't know. So that's a concern. But on the other hand, I've been a 17-year-old boy, and I remember my college years, and I certainly don't want those things to come back to me. And I think all of us who are parents and have sons are very sensitive to the idea that a woman could come forward with some accusation and in a very grand way just destroy the person's life, which is what we're engaged in now in Washington, right? So how do you feel? The answer is conflicted. Conflicted. I don't know who to believe. Nobody knows who to believe. And maybe a good column is not so much a political one, but a personal one, where you write it as a parent, and you say, as the father of daughters, I want this, but as someone who also has a son, let's put it this way, I want this. And I have to sort of make sense of this somehow. And it's complicated, it's not supposed to be simple. So that would be an interesting column, and maybe I'll get some great feedback on that. Why? Because sometimes people are sick of politics, and they want to talk about other things beyond politics. They want to talk about parenthood, and a column I did for Father's Day on a favorite uncle, and how those of us who are uncles, you can step up and be an uncle that's involved in your nephew's and niece's life or not. It's an optional role, right? And so my uncle had passed away, and I wrote a column about him. When I read about those personal topics, they take off. They take off. I get the equivalent of the Pulitzer in my line of work is what I call the Friggy. And that's when I get a piece of note from a nice woman who's a grandmother in Iowa. And she's reading me at a newspaper in Iowa, and she says, I read your column about the 10 things that we're doing wrong with raising our kids. Or I read your column about how we don't have enough of a work ethic in this country or something. And I cut it out of the paper. And I put it on the fridge. I put it on the refrigerator with a magnet, so when my grandkids come over, I'm going to show it to them. And I think that's great. That's awesome. I like hearing that. So that's what I aim for. I want to be able to speak to real people, human beings. I work for the Washington Post Writers Group, but I get the advantage of writing for the Washington Post from all the way out in California, which means I get to write with something called common sense, that they are lacking in Washington, D.C. They have a lot of it in Grand Junction. They have a lot of it where I grew up in Sanger, California, a population of 10,000 people. So that's what I try to do. That's how I define my role. And I started off as a writer who became a journalist, who became a multimedia communicator. So now when I sit down and do my taxes every year, you see that I've hosted radio shows, and I've been on television, and I've given speeches, and I've hosted podcasts and written columns and done all this stuff. And it's all the same thing. It's all about imparting information in ways that's clear and interesting and engaging, so that you can do what I want you to do, which is to just think. A lot of us know what we believe, but very few of us know why we believe it, right? We instinctively know our opinion, we're ready with our opinion, but not with the thought that backs up that opinion. So it's my job to provide you and incentivize you to think through this stuff. In terms of the Constitution, one of the reasons this is a brilliant document is because of what I learned in 8th grade when we had to learn the Constitution, and we had to study the Constitution, we had to study the preamble. In 8th grade, when you're still sort of afraid to go up in front of the class and speak, we had to memorize the preamble of the Constitution and go up there and say it. Now, because I am a child of the 70s, I was born in 1967, I am 51 years old, and I grew up and went to school in public school in the 70s, so I learned about the Constitution and American history and the preamble of the Constitution from that one source of wisdom that we all go to, and that's Schoolhouse Rock. So some of you may be too young to get that reference, but some of you are not. And if you're my age, the reason you know how government works and how a bill gets passed and what the function of a conjunction is because of Schoolhouse Rock, which was the most inspired thing I've ever seen, right? And it's this cartoon that would play on Saturday mornings. We would get up and watch cartoons, and in between, Scooby-Doo and whatever else was going on, there were the commercials, and the commercials would have Schoolhouse Rock, and it would be this little brilliant cartoon story about some facet of American history. So imagine the year is 1978, 79, I guess, and I'm in junior high school, and they said, we've got to all recite the preamble. So imagine 30 kids in Central California at my little school, Washington Junior High School, and we all go up to say the preamble. And instead of playing it straight and reading it straight, we go up there and start sounding like this. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And the professor, the teacher is a bit older, he doesn't get the reference, so he wants to know, why is everybody singing this thing? And so we're singing it because we remember it from television. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, right? So then from there, that you have the preamble, then you have the articles that set up the major deal, which is the executive power, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the like. So the rules of the game pretty much are laid out in the articles. And then you get to the amendments, which is the good stuff, right? And you get to the Bill of Rights, and you have many amendments to the Constitution and many interesting stories about how they came to be. You even have a famous amendment in there that was repealed, Prohibition. There was an amendment passed to outlaw alcohol, did not work out so well. It led to the boom of organized crime. Ultimately, the decision was made that this was more trouble than it was worth, and a lot of money was made by bootleggers and the like, and so they passed another amendment to repeal the Prohibition Amendment. There's a amendment that gives women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. And the whole suffrage movement and the fact that for many, many years it was just thought normal that men would vote and women wouldn't vote. And women took it upon themselves through the suffrage movement to protest, to be beaten, to be jailed, all for the right to vote. You have the amendment that changed the voting age, which was interesting. It used to be 21 forever and ever and ever. But during the Vietnam War, you were routinely going and seeing people go out to war, go to Vietnam, baby boomers, who were 18 years old. And so the idea took hold that it was profoundly unfair to ask 18, 19, 20-year-olds to go off and sometimes die in Vietnam if they couldn't vote for the president that was sending them there. So they passed an amendment saying we're going to change the voting age from 21 down to 18. These are all sort of the after effects. The top 10 amendments, and then of course you have the Civil War amendments. You have the 14th, 15th, and 16th amendments, right? The 14th Amendment, which is very rich, it's the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the idea that people who were born in the United States are guaranteed equal protection of the laws. If you have any kind of quibble over discrimination, if you think people are being treated differently because of their sexual orientation or their race or their gender or whatever, you go to the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, which freed the slaves, the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, and the 15th Amendment, which gave the slaves the right to vote. And isn't it interesting that freed slaves had the right to vote before women did? Right, you know that? So freed slaves had the right to vote before women did. And then you have the top 10 amendments, which I revisit and write about quite a bit. The Bill of Rights. And certainly some really important amendments in there that we'll discuss in a minute. The brilliance of the Constitution is that it tries to thread the needle on something called federalism. That before there was a Constitution, you know that there was the Articles of Confederation. And what happened was, coming from the strong central government of a monarchy in England, the first instinct of the colonists, of the colonial fighters and people in the colonies, was to have a very loose confederation. So much more power and decentralized power and much more power to the individual states. That was a mess. That was a complete disaster. So as brilliant as the Constitution was, it was born out of failure, and the failure was the Articles of Confederation. Because you can't have this collection of states, this confederation, without something linking them all together. So ultimately that was scrapped, and 231 days ago today, the Constitution was voted upon, was written in Freedom Hall in Philadelphia. And if I remember correctly, 2 years later in 1789, that's when it was ratified. And I think I remember that way back from 8th grade. And so the significance and brilliance of the Constitution was that it wanted to create a strong federal government, central government, that still had some respect for states' rights. We have not solved this in 230 years. If there's one thing that really is wrapped up into our DNA as Americans, it's the tension that exists between the strong federal government and states' rights. Most famously, in full display during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, right? Where, as I was saying today, one of my favorite examples of federalism is when in 1957, this is now 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, which was in 1954. In 1957, Arkansas decides, under Governor Faubus at the time, says, you know what, we're not going to do that. The Supreme Court has decided Brown versus Board of Education. It has said we have to desegregate our schools, which is different than integrate our schools. But we're not going to do it. we reserve the right as a sovereign state of Arkansas to defy that. And lo and behold, who's in the White House but Dwight D. Eisenhower, okay? Dwight D. Eisenhower is not a politician. Dwight D. Eisenhower is a former general. So you don't tell a general, I'm not going to follow this order. So he says, guess what, Arkansas? I'm going to teach you about federalism because I'm going to send to Little Rock the 101st Airborne Division. So we're going to send in the 101st Airborne, and we're going to send real-life soldiers with bayonets and rifles down there to escort these kids into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay? You can imagine what they said in Arkansas. Oh my God, the state's being invaded. It's being invaded by the federal government, right? But the lesson to the rest of us is, whenever a state faces off against the federal government, 9 times out of 10, the state loses. Okay? It's very rare when you find an instance where it's the other way around. Typically, the die is cast that when federalism goes up against states' rights, federalism and a strong federal government trumps states' rights. How does that matter now? This is how it matters now. When you have the state of Colorado passing a marijuana law, when you have my state of California passing a recreational use marijuana law, beyond medicinal marijuana now, you have a standoff with the federal government. And you have an Attorney General in Jeff Sessions, who at least is Attorney General at the moment, not much longer perhaps. But he doesn't believe that the state of Colorado or the state of California or other states have the right to pass marijuana laws. And so he's forcing a standoff between the federal government and the states over marijuana. You famously have in California an attempt to declare California a so-called sanctuary state, a very misleading term that applies that if illegal immigrants make it to California, they'll be safe and they won't be detectable and deportable by ICE, and that is untrue because ICE does business in California every single day. Because read paragraph 1, ICE does not work for the city of San Francisco. ICE does not work for the California legislature. The federal government does not take orders from the state of California. The state of California can declare anything it wants. It can declare the state flower a golden poppy. It doesn't matter because the term sanctuary state has no legal basis. ICE doesn't respect it. It tramples all over it. And every single day in that so-called sanctuary state, people are apprehended and deported. You would not know that from watching Fox News, where I appear often. You would not know that from listening to Sean Hannity on the radio. Because the narrative among conservative Republicans, based in a deep and profound ignorance about the immigration issue, is that California is this free-for-all where if you can just get there as an illegal immigrant, they're not going to find you, deport you, or bother you. It's a complete and total lie. Why? Paragraph 1, federalism. Federal government doesn't take orders from the states. You have to understand that. So we have a whole sanctuary debate now. And in California, it's gotten really, really freaky because you have individual counties that are rebelling against the state. So let me get this straight. The state is rebelling against the federal government, okay? And individual counties are rebelling against the state. So individual counties are passing ordinances by their county board of supervisors to say, you can enforce immigration law here. If they paid attention to the first part of the lecture, they would realize this is a pointless exercise because the federal government is like, okay, thank you. They don't need their permission, they're doing it anyway. And now individual cities are rebelling against the individual counties. You with me? Federal government, the state, the county, the city. And it's a bunch of lawyers, God. And it's a bunch of politicians, and they're all just chasing their tail. And what do I know? I'm the son of a cop, and I know that cops do what cops are going to do, which cops is arrest people. And so every single day, ICE is arresting people, independent of whatever the politicians do. But it keeps us all busy, and it keeps the radio hosts occupied, and it keeps the columnists employed. So there's an instance of how the Constitution really comes up and grabs me by the throat, right? Another point to bring up that comes to mind, I remember in Dallas, Texas, when I was working for the Dallas Morning News, covering the issue of what to do during the War on Terror with so-called enemy combatants. And what would happen is if we grabbed somebody on the battlefield, we didn't want to treat them as a prisoner of war because we had to then declare them a prisoner of war, and we had to abide by the Geneva Convention and all the other rules laid out about how we should treat prisoners of war. Occasionally, it would get sticky because imagine you're in a battlefield in Afghanistan and you apprehend somebody and he turns out that he's US born. So he's a US citizen. So now the lawyers swoop in and say, well, now he's entitled to certain rights under the Constitution, like due process. The federal government says, well, we don't want to treat him as a prisoner of war because we don't want to have to follow Geneva. This is all the Bush administration. And guess what? More lawyers. And they said, but we don't want to necessarily treat him as a US citizen because then the Constitution takes effect. If only there was some gray area. So they reach all the way back to World War II and they come up with this concept of the enemy combatant. And they designate people like Jose Padilla, who was born in Chicago and who was arrested for creating a dirty bomb. And they declare him an enemy combatant, which basically means you can lock him in a hole and leave him there forever, or at least for 10 or 15 years. You can stick him in Guantanamo, you can stick him in federal prison, whatever. No Constitution for you as a US citizen, no Constitution for you, and no Geneva Convention for you. You're in this gray area. So I'm an editorial writer at the Dallas Morning News, and I'm looking at all this, and I'm thinking, this doesn't sound right. It may sound legal, according to some really smart lawyers in the Bush administration, but it doesn't sound good. You can't just throw out everything and treat it, lock them up. This isn't the Count of Monte Cristo. This is, you throw them in and throw away the key. So that gave me a chance to explore the Fifth Amendment and due process, and the Sixth Amendment and the right to a speedy trial, and other amendments. Finally, and most recently, I got a primer on this amendment, and it reads like this. Every time there's a school shooting in America, the NRA comes forward and it reads us this amendment. Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So I would go on the radio, on conservative radio in San Diego, and say, here's where I'm coming from on this. First of all, again, I'm the son of a cop. I grew up around guns. I grew up around guns in the house. They were very common. My dad always had guns. Literally, there was a Winchester above the fireplace. I grew up in farm country where people went hunting. My dad would take me hunting and take family members hunting and cousins and the like and uncles and the like. There were gun racks in the back of pickup trucks where I grew up, so I'm very comfortable around guns. So I'm not anti-gun, but I'm also not enamored with guns, okay? I don't have this unhealthy obsession with guns. There are people I hear from when I host radio shows who are clear they like guns more than they like their fellow human beings. And that's not me. So the fascination with guns, the fact that everybody thinks they need an AR-15, and it costs $1,500. How many do you have? 6? What? Why? What? Well, the Constitution says so. No, well, actually, here's what the Constitution says. Well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So you have the right to keep and bear arms, but if we're going to have a conversation about, restricting that right somehow, you do not get to say, hey, wait, hands off. That's an absolute right. It is not an absolute right. Just like somehow the defenders of the pro-choice position found in the Fourth Amendment an inherent right to privacy, and then somehow turn that around into a decision in Roe v. Wade to say that a woman has a right to an abortion, under that doesn't mean that once you've established that right, you can't have states like Pennsylvania and elsewhere put restrictions on abortion, like a parental notification law, like a waiting period. The courts have said those are all legal. Now, hardcore feminists don't think that way. They think the abortion is an absolute right as guaranteed by the Constitution, and if you mess with it, you're infringing on my right. And we say, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. Even if we go along with Roe v. Wade, you can still support Roe v. Wade and be pro-choice and still think it's okay to have a parental notification law. Where's that written, right? So I get the far left wingers who hold on to that right as an absolute right, don't touch it. And then I got the right wingers over here on guns, absolute right, don't touch it. And I would say to people, what do I know? My dad would tell me stories of knocking at a door at 3 in the morning and walking into a domestic violence situation. And he'd go in and the wife would be sitting there with a black eye, and he'd say, where's your husband? And she'd say, he's in the bedroom. My dad's first question, he's in uniform, 3 in the morning, does he have guns? And she'd say, oh yeah, he got a lot of guns. He's an NRA member. He got automatic weapon this, semi-automatic this, AR-15 this and that. He's got about 6 or 7 guns in there. And I always tell people when I'm hosting radio shows, you know where Wayne LaPierre is right then? Wayne LaPierre is the vice president of the National Rifle Association, and he's always out there talking about he's pro-cop, and he wants to defend the Second Amendment. Wayne LaPierre at 3 in the morning is at home in bed, under the covers. When my old man, okay, in uniform, is knocking on a door, dealing with a guy in a bedroom who's got 6 or 7 guns. So if I say that you have the right to bear arms, and I say that I'm going to limit the number of guns you buy, is that a violation? Some people say, yeah. I say no. It doesn't say anything about the number of guns. And then here's the kicker. When I talk to people, and I get them engaged in a radio show about this, and I say, tell you what, I don't want to infringe on your right to bear arms. I just want to say that you can't buy a certain kind of gun. Well, they freak out. They think the AR-15 is the modern-day equivalent of the Winchester. They have it all twisted in their head, what this is. And they'll say the most crazy thing, and I'll share it with you. They'll say, look, the way I see it, the reason the Second Amendment is there, it's to say basically that every individual has the right to accumulate and acquire the same level of firepower as the federal government. In case the shit hits the fan, I have to be able to defend myself against the federal government. So then I begin to have some fun, because I like having fun. So I said, so let me get this straight. Do you have a big backyard? Yeah. Is there enough room in your backyard for an aircraft carrier? Do you have enough room back there for, a nuclear warhead? Because if you want to go mano a mano against Uncle Sam, I got to tell you, I'm going to put my money on Uncle Sam. And by the way, you've so twisted the Second Amendment that if you read this, the reason we were going to have a militia in the first place was because what? Being necessary for the security of a free state. The framers wrote the Second Amendment to say that you had a right to bear arms to defend the federal government. If the British land again, right, and they want payback, which they did in 1812. Not that you have the right to bear arms so you can overthrow the federal government. So a little respect to James Madison, right? Madison was a smart guy. Madison wrote the Second Amendment. He wrote it for a reason, to say you all have the right to bear arms in case you have to defend your government. Not because you have the right to overthrow your government and you want to have mano for mano aircraft carrier and match them bullet for bullet. How did you get there from here? And that is, I think, the important, interesting part about this discussion. We have taken, no pun intended, certain liberties with the way we deal with the Constitution. And we've become very convenient in the way we apply it. And when we want to see something in it, we'll see something in it. If we believe that there's an abortion right somewhere buried in the Fourth Amendment, then we'll go there. And if we believe that the Second Amendment gives you the right to overthrow your government, then we'll believe that. That doesn't mean that it was ever written that way. It doesn't mean any logical read of the Constitution can get you there. So I'll leave you with this important message. I'll do my part, and I'll continue to do my part to take the complicated and try to make it simple and clear the fog. And you have to do your part, which is no matter how disgusted you may be at the moment with the news media, and we have earned it, we have definitely earned that disgust by getting into the arena, by spreading what people call fake news, by putting an opinion where it doesn't belong, by trying to tell you how to think, and all these things that we've done wrong and that I've written about. It doesn't make my fellow journalists happy when I write those columns, but those columns exist. I'll do my part in terms of clearing the fog, but you don't get to turn off your radio, your television, and put down your newspaper. You don't get to put down your phone. You do not get to tune out, because this is a really critical time for the country, for the world. It sort of matters that North Korea has missiles that can reach San Francisco. It's important for you to stay on top of that. And it's important to understand the trade debate and tariffs and how it is that conservatives and Republicans who used to hate tariffs now love tariffs. And that China has decided we're going to retaliate tit for tat and combat us with tariffs of their own. And it's important to understand, for instance, the Kavanaugh hearings and understand that this is no way to pick a Supreme Court justice. We're in for a very bad day on Monday, a circus atmosphere. But it's important to sort of understand heads or tails of all this. And the only way to make your way through this is by availing yourself to what we call the news media. You can watch different kinds of media, you can flip back and forth, you can make up your own mind, you can ask questions. You cannot turn off your TV, your radio, your computer, your laptop, or put away the newspaper. No fair, you can't check out. It's too important. And as we say in my business, politics is way too important to be left to the politicians. So all of us have that responsibility to keep a really firm eye on our government, The framers of the Constitution had in mind that government would work best if it didn't work at all, and that the individual was paramount, and freedom was paramount. And the framers would expect of us that we be ever vigilant in keeping an eye on those people who are sworn to represent us, and sometimes fall short in that. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.